welcome to my channel, Apologetics 101, where you will learn the facts the critics don't want you to know. Of course, I'm your host, Brian Kipo, and today we are going to be doing a debate review that I've been trying to make for some time between Dr. Jonathan McLatchie and Matt Dillahunty. Matt Dillahunty is a well-known atheist and internet YouTuber. He's also the main host of Atheist Experience, a atheistic medium out of Austin, Texas, from what I understand. He's been an atheist for a long time, apparently, but he's a big deal on the internet as far as internet atheists go. And Dr. Jonathan McLatchie is a scientist, but he's also a Christian apologist, a very popular one. And they had a debate on Modern Day Debate. Full disclosure, I had actually gotten permission, and I got this probably at least a couple months ago, from James Coons, who is the host of Modern Day Debate, for me to do this review. I asked his permission. He actually opened the door. He thought it was so incredible that I actually was considerate enough to ask for permission that he actually opened the door for me to do any debate review of any of his debates on his channel, which I thought was really, really cool of him. And I probably will take him up on that offer. But just to let you know, I do have permission to do this debate review. I originally did a debate review of this debate, but it was so long that I couldn't get it to load properly on YouTube, so I wound up with technical difficulties, and then I couldn't get the original program to go back into my editing software so I can edit it out, so I can split it up into parts. And so I've been putting it off of redoing it, and now I've decided to, since I'm growing my channel a little bit more on the apologetic area, I decided to do this debate review. I got tagged on Twitter by Jonathan McLatchie himself, who said he wanted a link to this video once I have done. I probably will wait until after I've gotten all the parts of this video. It will be breaking up into parts because there's no other way I can do it. I got to make sure that it's not too long for YouTube. This was a very long debate, over 2 hours long, and obviously if I'm stopping it, making commentary and things like that, it's going to be even longer. I'm going to skip over Jonathan McLatchie's opening case, because much of what me and Jonathan argue, we agree on a lot of things as far as what he argues in his debate. We differ on some trivial issues, some methodological issues, but there wasn't a whole lot as far as evidence goes that we differed in this debate. As far as that goes, obviously he's a theistic evolutionist. I don't agree with evolution, but that's not the issue in this debate. That's not even a factor. And of course, Jonathan McLatchie was also using a approach that I don't normally use on my case of resurrection. It's called the maximum data approach. Typically, I use my own argument on the resurrection, which I call the historical approach, which is kind of in between the minimalistic facts approach to resurrection and the maximum data approach. But the difference is with the minimalistic facts approach, they rely on, or the emphasis is on 99.9% agreement among all scholars, but scholars are notorious for disagreeing with one another. So my case allows more data, like the maximum data case, but unlike the maximum data case, I'm still much more restricted on the kind of information and evidence and data I do allow, because I don't really want to throw in too much controversial issues and a lot of side issues and things like that. But with the maximum data case, it opens the door to a lot of these side issues, and those are important, and they deserve their own debates over them. I think there's good reasons and good evidence substantiating them. Like I said, I didn't differ with Jonathan's arguments on that. But the question is not really whether I differ with him on what he said, as much as would I have done that, presented that and talked about, whether or not if John's gospel is based on eyewitness testimony and that sort of thing. I think there's good evidence for it being based on eyewitness testimony, but it's not necessary because the resurrection proclamation is much earlier than the Gospels, and can be found in an early creedal tradition within 1 Corinthians 15 Creed. So I don't think it's necessary to really focus too much on these side issues. But that notwithstanding, much of what Jonathan had to say in this debate, I appreciated and liked. And by the way, you guys like my new hat? I was told by a little girl today when I was doing my taxes, my accountant's little girl, and she said that it looked. She called me Mr. Park Ranger. Then she took my hat from me. But no, I got this hat because I know it seems corny, but it reminded me of Indiana Jones hat. I mean, it looks exactly like the Indiana Jones hat. It's a fedora. It's a large fedora. It's about the same color. Might be not quite the same shade. But it looks very similar to Indiana Jones. And it was on clearance at Walmart. I worked at Walmart at the time of this video, and so I had bought this hat for like $8, and I've been wearing it ever since, and I like it. Makes me look dashing and daring and adventurous and that sort of thing. So I got it. But at any rate, I'm going to be doing this debate review again, like I said, in parts. Part one, I'm going to skip over Jonathan's opening case because it's not necessary for me to comment on his opening case. So I'm going to talk about the opening argument of Matt Dillahunty. Then I'm going to do a part two, which is going to address the rebuttal session, and this is going to address Matt Dillahunty's response. This is also going to deal with now part three. I'm going to be talking about the crossfire section, and this might be split up into two parts, but I don't know. If not, I'm going to try to see if I can get the crossfire section in one part. And of course, part four will be dealing with the Q&A session, or the closing arguments of both Matt and Jonathan, and dealing with the Q&A session. And I will also be making my closing remarks, my closing argument, and my overall evaluation of the entire debate. All right, so if luck persists, I'm hoping to get this finished in at least 4 videos, maybe possibly 5, but I'm gonna try 4. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you do, please like this video. It helps with the YouTube algorithm. Also, leave a comment section. Also, if you want to, you can leave a comment section of what you think of my hat. Do you think it looks like Indiana Jones, or it makes it a little more dashing than normal, or whatnot? Let's do this. Let's get into this debate, because we have a lot to cover. All right, let's get this debate over with. Again, I am specifically doing just Matt Dillahunty's opening statement for part 1.
I'm assuming you can hear me. I'll start my stopwatch. How are we doing? So, is anything, and this isn't the rebuttal, I wrote this is just my opening statement. Is there anything that we're going to consider today that couldn't be counted as hearsay? And I would argue that hearsay is not particularly strong evidence. Hearsay often isn't even admissible in a court of law. So in deciding whether or not to bring a case, a district attorney evaluates the evidence and should make a decision based on what they think they can prove, what a judge, the determiner of the facts in the case, is going to actually allow, and what they may or may not find convincing, or what other people, a jury, may find convincing. So in order to do that, they want the strongest evidence possible.
All right. This is where he starts contrasting a case with the case of the resurrection with a court. What kind of evidence a legal proceeding or a courtroom would, or a judge would admit in a courtroom. And this commits a fallacy in logic called the false analogy fallacy. The way, when you're dealing with historical studies versus the legal system, you're dealing with two very different situations. In one case, you're dealing with the historical studies, which are limited by the sources that we are evaluating historical information from, versus a courtroom proceedings, which they do not want to be in any kind of doubt whatsoever that the person is guilty. And you're dealing with two different kinds of situations. Therefore, this commits a fallacy logic called the false analogy fallacy, which is what he's actually making. Because historians would admit evidence such as secondhand reports. They would they often have sources that cite sources that we no longer have, and they can admit those kinds of testimonies. They've admitted testimonies 100 years after the fact, things like that. And these kinds of things wouldn't be admissible in a court of law, but they are admissible by a historian. They are admissible in historical studies. So you're dealing with two different situations here. You're dealing with one's historical studies versus a courtroom proceedings. The courtroom proceedings, totally different situation. And as a result, this commits the false analogy fallacy. It's a false comparison. And of course, the historical studies admit secondhand reports, whereas in courtroom proceedings, they may not admit secondhand reports. And plus, I would argue that the 1 Corinthians 15 Creed is an eyewitness report coming directly from the disciples. That's the part that gets overlooked. It's not like Paul is picking this up from strangers on the street or something. He's getting this information directly from the disciples themselves, directly from the eyewitnesses. Paul is generally regarded by other historians and scholars, even the rather skeptical ones, as being a very reliable and honest historian, or honest person. They don't think that Paul is lying or making things up. And of course, we could test him in his honesty as well, in references. I'm not going to go into that at this point, but he is often regarded as being reliable and honest. And he is giving evidence, testimony. He's presenting the disciples' testimony, but he's also presenting his own testimony because he also had an experience. He adds himself to the creed as well. And his experience of this is also firsthand, not secondhand. Let's continue.
Well, that's why I was happy when I saw that we were going to do a debate on the strong evidence for the resurrection. And my first question, of course, is, well, what counts as strong evidence? Well, normally we would want physical evidence that's consistent with the events and points to the conclusion that we're trying to advocate for. We would actually like witness testimonies, provided that those witnesses can be presented, evaluated, questioned, examined, we can determine how much their statements align. If you recorded a deposition of someone giving their testimony or something, would it be allowed in court if that person died? Yeah, it turns out that in many cases, even someone who has died, their deposition would be allowed in court. And part of that reason for...
All right. Let me cover some, look at I want you to pay attention to the standard of evidence that he's requiring. No historian would require this kind of standard of evidence that he's looking at right now. He's not looking at this from a historical perspective. He's not even trying to look at it from a historical perspective. He wants to compare it to a courtroom proceedings, which can leave no room for doubt at all. And no historian you couldn't find out anything in history using the standard of evidence. He's talking about physical evidence. Later, he might not have said it here yet. He'll talk about DNA evidence, blood samples, things like that. How are you going to get a DNA sample of somebody from history? But that's exactly the kind of standard of evidence he wants. He wants it to be beyond a shadow of a doubt. And the way to do that, he wants the physical evidence. Did you know the only physical evidence, and this is the only thing I can think of that he would even come close to talking about, the only physical evidence associated with historical studies is archaeology. But we have very little archaeology that's been discovered compared to the scope of everything we know of history from historical sources. A very small amount. The vast majority of what historians know about the past comes from literary documentary sources. If we had to have physical evidence for anything in history to be true or substantiated, we would know next to nothing about history. This is why historians don't rely on archaeology alone. In fact, archaeology adds I'm not trying to underplay the contribution that archaeology makes in historical studies, but it's very minimized. It mostly fills in the blanks, helps corroborate some of the historical sources that we have. It's good to elaborate a little bit more on, help us elaborate a little bit more on what historical sources are talking about. But it gives us very, very minimal amount of information and evidence compared to everything that we potentially could know about history based on the sources that we do have. So this kind of standard of evidence is unfair and unreasonable. We would know next to nothing about history if applying his argument logically to its logical conclusion and being consistent with it. Let's continue.
For that is that when giving a deposition, cross-examination is part of it. The process by which we go about getting a deposition would allow even someone who was dead to have their deposition considered in a court. Would that also be true if the deposition was anonymous? Probably not. There may be some extenuating circumstances where someone whose anonymity is valued in the greater scheme of things, but they wouldn't be anonymous to the court. Now, oh my gosh, why is he talking about a courtroom? Are we trying to take God to court? Well, yeah, actually. Because if your view is that there's strong evidence for this, then it should withstand anything that we would hold in a courtroom of presenting good evidence and determining whether or not there's reasonable grounds to make a conclusion about what the actual case is.
Of course, if we have to sit there and have, if we can't consider it strong evidence unless you can hold up into a court of law, then next to nothing about history can never be conceived. I mean, how could you? I mean, most of what historians are willing to accept in historical studies, second and third hand sources are hundreds of years after the fact. These kinds of things would not be admissible in a court of law, but they are admissible in historical studies, which is where we're at. So again, this commits the false analogy fallacy. Now he talks about deposition being anonymous. This is going to be an interesting one because he applies this to the Bible as a whole. And we'll see how this plays out here in a minute because he's about to unfold that argument in just a second.
And so what if you couldn't demonstrate, though, that the recording that you had of this deposition had not been altered? Like there was no good chain of custody of evidence. Or if there were actual evidence that the deposition that was given had been altered, that it didn't line up with stuff, or that we'd lost the original and we just had a copy. There are reasons that hearsay is not considered strong evidence. In the case of the Bible, We don't have testimonials or depositions. No one is under oath. No one is being questioned. What we have is propaganda from anonymous, altered, ancient accounts.
Let me let him finish that real quick. That's all.
That's it. Eyewitness testimony is unreliable. I'm not saying that.
All right. Okay, Matt is ultimately treating the Bible like it's one source. It's almost like he's attacking what he thinks about the Gospels and applying it to the whole Bible. Like the Gospels are anonymous, so the whole Bible must be anonymous. Except the whole Bible is not anonymous. A lot of people identify themselves. Now he might not believe that the persons whose names are ascribed on there, Jeremiah wrote the book of Jeremiah, or Isaiah wrote Isaiah, or Paul wrote the 13 Pauline epistles, or Peter wrote First and Second Peter. You might not believe these people actually wrote these books, but that's still not considered anonymous. In fact, that's actually not even what scholars consider to be anonymous. The word anonymous to scholars simply means this. It means that the text in question does not identify the author. It does not mean that we do not know who the writer is. It doesn't mean that we don't have no way of knowing who the writer is. It just simply means that the writer's identity is not identified specifically in the text. But what if the writer's identity is specifically identified in the text, but that person didn't write it? We actually can substantiate that through evidence. Let's say the Gospel of Thomas, for example. We know Thomas didn't write the Gospel of Thomas. It was probably written after the middle of the 2nd century, most likely toward the late 2nd century. And Thomas obviously didn't write it. And there's actually lots of evidence for that, but I'm not going to go into that. It's not necessary. Everyone was pretty much in agreement that Thomas didn't write the Gospel of Thomas. All right. Is that anonymous? No. Well, wait a minute. Nobody thinks that Thomas wrote the Gospel of Thomas. True. But it's not categorized as anonymous. It's actually a categorical error, because categorically it's identified as pseudepigrapha. It basically is it's a long, fancy Greek word that means false title or falsely ascribed. It's simply, that is the category that it would be classified as, even if you don't agree with who wrote it. It would not be considered anonymous. The Gospels are anonymous in the sense that it is defined by scholars that the Gospel writers do not identify their authorship. It doesn't mean that nobody has any idea who wrote them. It doesn't mean that we have no evidence of who wrote them, because we have external evidence to identify the writers, and it's consistent with what we know of internally of the Gospels. So we do have a way of knowing who wrote the Gospels. But either way, the point is that Matt is taking this argument and applying it to the whole Bible. Why does he think the whole Bible is not anonymous? And then you got Paul's letters. Let's assume that he's against Paul writing the 6 disputed epistles. There's 6 of Paul's epistles that are disputed, but seven of them are not disputed. They're undisputed. In fact, we label these as the undisputed epistles of Paul. I want to read you something from a book by Bart Ehrman. He is a leading skeptic in the United States against Christianity. He writes against Christianity. In fact, he rejects almost all of the New Testament writings being traditionally written by the people whose names are ascribed to them, or is traditionally identified as them, except for the 7 epistles of Paul. In his book Forged, Bart Ehrman says on page 93, he says, virtually all scholars agree that 7 of Pauline letters are authentic. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. These 7 cohere well together and appear systematically, theologically, and in every other way to be on by the same person. They all claim to be written by Paul. There's scarcely reason to doubt that there actually was to doubt that they were actually written by Paul. That is from Bart Ehrman, again, page 93 of his book, Forged. And Bart Ehrman actually even acknowledges that Paul wrote the 7 epistles. So even if Matt wants to doubt the writing of all the other works in the Bible and falsely identify even those writings he don't think were written by them, whose names are specifically ascribed on them and labeled as anonymous, does he think that the 7 undisputed epistles of Paul wasn't written by Paul? And 1 Corinthians 15:3, by the way, is found within 1 Corinthians, the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians is one of the 7 undisputed epistles of Paul. I don't know. He doesn't outright deny Paul writing those books, so I'm not exactly sure why he tries to lump the entire Bible as one source and claim it's all anonymous. He also says altered, which is weird. When I first watched this debate, I watched this debate hundreds of times, and I don't know, and I didn't know for a long time why Matt used the term altered. Someone in the comment section who was debating me for a little bit tried to argue they used or altered, and when I asked him what he mean by altered, he claimed the guy that was debating me, not Matt. He claimed that he was talking about different translations, which nobody who's ever translated anything. I studied the original language of the Bible. I know how to translate Hebrew and Greek. I'm not as well sufficient for somebody that's been there for years, and there's still a lot of words that I have to look up and stuff. But I still know about translation, and I still know about the syntax of the languages and things like that. And I've got a lot of Greek words memorized and even Hebrew words. But the point is that because I know a lot about translations, translators don't claim that differences in translations are altered. For one thing, the work being translated into other languages was not written into those later languages originally. It was written in a different language. Okay, so it's not being altered. It's not altered when other translators have differences between the translations. This is due to the fact that we're dealing with a different language. Okay, and we're translating from a different language. And because we're doing that, we're trying to put it as close as we can in our language. And then, of course, you can't put it exactly like that because then it wouldn't make sense to people. So there's dynamic equivalence that has to be employed as well. And as a result, there are differences that may come out in those translations. This is not the same as an alteration. Now, does Matt mean this, like this guy in this debate did with me? No. And by the way, it's not the debate that I had with Hunter Jagrawal from India. I've got that debate review on YouTube. This is not when I've done a review on it. It wasn't as long as that debate, nowhere near. But does Matt mean that by the word altered? I don't think so. I think he means textually altered. He could mean translational because I think I've heard him argue something similar with translations before. And again, it's a mistake because obviously Matt's never translated anything before. If he did, he knows that translations aren't alterations to begin with. But I don't think that that's what he means. The context of it appears to be in reference to textual because he talks about depositions of not having the original copy and he ends up talking about Bible being copies of copies and that sort of thing. And so my guess is when he says altered, he is talking about in the manuscripts, which becomes problematic because we actually have a tremendous amount of manuscripts of the New Testament. In fact, we have about 5,800 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, which blows apart everything we have from ancient history. We only have so many manuscripts of Tacitus, and the earliest is like 1,000 years after he was writing. But we have 5,800 Greek manuscripts, and we even have fragments within less than a generation of the writer's lifetime, which is tremendously good. And we've got manuscripts all over the Roman Empire. They went all over the place. So we got what's called multiple lines of transmission, and by cross-checking other manuscripts, this is what helps us to reconstruct the original text of the New Testament. The manuscript evidence of the New Testament is actually stronger than everything else we have from ancient history, and that's a fact. That's not my opinion. Now, given that, okay, we have the manuscript evidence for 1 Corinthians 15. We got multiple lines of transmission. All manuscripts containing the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians has this creed in it, with very little difference, if any. And of course, when you have such a staticness in the manuscripts, as far as the reading doesn't change that much. It might change a little bit, barely, but it won't. If it doesn't change that much, if it's very static in the manuscripts, this is a telltale sign that it goes back to the original text. If it's altered a lot, given all the manuscripts, all of the Roman Empire, this would be a telltale sign that it doesn't go back to the original text. The fact that it's very static in the manuscripts indicates that it goes back to the original text in the form in which we have it. In which case, the burden of proof, get this, is on the skeptic who wants to deny that 1 Corinthians 15 creed, the creedal tradition we have of the eyewitness report of Jesus' resurrection, doesn't go back to the original text. And you gotta understand, another thing you have to understand is 1 Corinthians predates all four Gospels. Yeah, it predates all four Gospels. It doesn't. So bringing up things like the Gospel, I understand. Part of it was Jonathan's fault, because Jonathan used the maximum data approach, which opened the door for these other side issues and things like that. And of course, the reality of it, though, is even if Jonathan never even brought up the Gospels, Matt would have brought them up. They're like a default reaction from the skeptics. But the reality of it is that that this is a fallacy in logic called a red herring. It's irrelevant to the case for the resurrection, because the resurrection is reported far earlier than the Gospels in sources that are considered reliable even by skeptical scholars like Bart Ehrman, Gerd Ludemann, etc. In reference to the resurrection appearances, Gerd Ludemann said that it could be taken as, I'm quoting him, it could be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Bart Ehrman concedes to this. Richard Carrier concedes to it. He's an atheist and a mythicist, Richard Carrier is. And it's widely agreed. It's widely agreed. In fact, it's probably about, if you were to poll scholars, it'd be over 99.9% of scholars, Christian and non-Christian alike, are in agreement with this. The evidence is very strong. Paula Fredrickson is a liberal historian, not a Christian. And she said that I know in their own terms they saw the raised Jesus. That's what they said, and that's what all the historical evidence afterwards tells us that they said they saw. She said, did they saw the raised Jesus? I don't know. I wasn't there, but I do know as a historian, they must have seen something. So the burden of proof for someone denying that 1 Corinthian creed was somehow altered would be on Matt. What evidence do you have that it's altered? He says, oh, we have no evidence that it was altered, that it was not altered. Okay, that is the appealing to possibility fallacy. The fact that it's possible that it could be altered is it probable that it's altered. You'd have to show evidence that it was been altered. You can't just simply assume that it is not altered or that it was altered. What evidence do you have that it was altered? I have evidence that shows that it wasn't because we got the manuscript. We got the manuscript evidence. So I've got evidence that it was not altered. But what evidence do you have that it was? You don't have any evidence. So you should make that assertion. You don't know. Well, we do know because we have the evidence that it wasn't, but you don't know that it was altered. All right, he says, okay, anonymous, altered, ancient source. The fact that it's ancient doesn't make it untrue. I don't know why he throws that. I guess he throws that in there in order so people can carry on their own implications with the word ancient, as if somehow being very old somehow makes it false or inaccurate or unreliable. No, it doesn't. So I don't know what he was trying to substantiate with that. And again, we also have, like I said, the false analogy fallacy in place. Courtroom proceedings and historical studies are not the same thing. Let's continue.
That means that somebody's a liar. That would be a fallacy to conclude that. The point.
Oh yeah, he mentioned eyewitness testimony. He referenced it as a fallacy to say that they were lying about it. He's right, it is. But if he's going to say that eyewitness testimony is notorious unreliable, and then conclude that the eyewitness testimony of the Bible must, or the resurrection must be unreliable, this commits a fallacy in logic called the hasty generalization fallacy. Hasty generalization fallacy is a fallacy in which you argue from specific examples, such as certain examples of unreliable eyewitness testimony, and then apply that generally to overall. Some people try to lessen the blow by not saying that all testimony or all eyewitness testimony is unreliable. They'll say like most, but that's still commit the fallacy. Ultimately, when you deal with eyewitness testimony, you're dealing with something that is a case-by-case basis. Some eyewitness testimony is unreliable, some is not. Of course, it also depends on how you're gauging reliability. Are you being reliability because there might be differences in some minor details or something of that nature? That's not how historians look at reliability. It's not how we generally look at reliability, because we expect differences of independent accounts. But if you're assuming that somehow they got to be unreliable unless they exactly agree on every detail, then that's not reliability. That's a questionable reliability, because it makes me think that maybe they got together and cooked this thing up if they're exactly right or exactly aligned in every respect. We expect differences. All right, let's continue.
Point is that we know that our eyewitness testimony is unreliable under the best circumstances. I have like friends where we'll get together and reminisce about things we did 15, 20 years ago, and everybody has a different recollection of it, including who was right and who was wrong. Granted, that's not as big a deal as to whether or not you watched somebody rise from the dead. I will grant you that.
I'm glad he grants that, because I was going to point out the fact that you can't really make that contrast with something that's insignificant, that's easy to forget or remember differently. When it comes to a major event, that's a huge difference, because psychologists recognize something called what they call light bulb memories. And what light bulb memories are sometimes things happen to us and around us or in front of us, or that we find out about. They're just so traumatic that they impress upon our psyche very strongly, to the point where they engrave into our memories, and we don't forget about them. The 50 years could pass, 80 years could pass, 100 years could pass, and we would still remember those details. And remember with startling specifics, things that you wouldn't think we would remember about, but we do. Remember where we were, what we were doing, how we found out about it. People that were there during the JFK assassination remember exactly how it happened. They can tell you, even people that survived today that lived there can tell you exactly what happened. People on the Titanic can could relate the story. People during World War II, people in Vietnam War, people that were alive today. There are people today that could tell you about the 9/11 incident. I remember on the 9/11 incident, I can tell you exactly where I were, what I was doing, how I found out about it. I could tell you details that happened initially when I first found out about the event. When I went home and I watched it, I saw the second tower collapse, and I saw this on live TV. I remember all that. I remember exactly where I was living at the time. I mean, I can remember those specific details about an event that has a traumatic impact on my psyche. Somebody rising from the dead is hardly the same, and I'm glad Matt agrees with this. It's hardly the same as some insignificant detail that doesn't really matter a whole lot. You just can't make that contrast.
But in this case, we don't know whose testimony what we're looking at. Is this an actual eyewitness? Is it secondhand? Is it thirdhand? We have no way to investigate it.
We do have a way to investigate. That's a constant mantra of Matt Dillahunty. He'll say, we don't have no way to investigate it. When in reality, we do. We wouldn't know things about it if we couldn't investigate it. We can investigate about this report. The problem is we have to use a standard he won't accept, namely because we have to use testimony, and he doesn't accept testimony as evidence, or if it is evidence, he doesn't accept it as strong evidence. And we'll get back to that later because this will come up in the debate. I don't want to deal with it at this time until it's specifically targeted.
The things that they are claiming don't have physical evidence to corroborate them. They don't have any supporting physical evidence. It's not like we can provide a body or compare DNA or look at a tomb or anything.
This is an extremely terrible argument. All right. He wants physical evidence to be convinced it's true. No amount of historical evidence would ever convince him because all historical evidence is based on historical sources, which we do not have physical evidence of this nature. And he wants DNA. Is he serious? DNA evidence. I mean, what do you want? A blood sample? I mean, so whose blood sample is that over there in that on that table? Oh, that's Jesus' blood sample. Oh, we need a body. This is something that's interesting because, or at least funny, because he'll say this later with the empty tomb. And to corroborate the empty tomb, he said, produce the dang body. He cussed, though, when he said it. But he says, produce the dang body. Why would I have to produce a body to prove an empty tomb? And if Jesus resurrected from the dead, why would I need to produce a body, when the tomb is empty? If there was a body in the tomb, that would disprove the resurrection, not prove it. Because what the ancient world believed on the resurrection, because the word resurrection is applied only to a physical resurrection. So I wouldn't have to produce a body to prove that Jesus rose again from the dead or an empty tomb. In fact, if a body was still in the tomb, that would disprove it. But yeah, his standard of evidence is unjustified. It's unreasonable because no amount of historical evidence would ever prove it to him. He sets the deck up that way, so no matter what, it cannot be proven to him because he knows that there's no physical evidence for anything in history. I mean, not like that. I mean, do you expect to have DNA evidence of Alexander the Great? I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous. But anyway, but you see the kind of standard of evidence he wants. He wants DNA. He wants to see the tomb. The tomb can't be empty unless he sees it. He wants to be able to cross-check the eyewitnesses. Be able to talk to them personally. When historians accept the fact that the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem in AD 70, all they have to go on is the testimony of Josephus. We have a little archaeology, but it's not enough to substantiate the details of it. Primarily, what we know about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 comes from Josephus, a Jewish historian who was alive during that time. Do we have to have Josephus in front of us and talk to Josephus for us to know that event happened? No. But for Matt, he thinks that we do.
So what sort of evidence would we expect? If we were to be the biggest charitable listener and we lived in a world where we were convinced that there was in fact a God and that Jesus existed, I was talking about what sort of evidence we might expect if in fact there were actually a God behind this. And I would argue that we probably expect the best evidence possible, because you were God and you had gone to this extraordinary length to do whatever it is that needed to be done in this resurrection. And it was important for people to actually have a sound evidence-based belief of this, that you would do your best to make sure that the best evidence were available. And clearly, God should have access to the best evidence and should be able to present it. And yet that's not what happened. We don't have that. We don't even have close to that. God, if it exists, has done nothing to preserve the chain of evidence, nothing to vouch for its reliability, hasn't even presented the idea of preserve the identity of the individuals performing or putting forward these claims.
All right. Okay. First of all, note what Matt is arguing. He's basically arguing that God doesn't convince me that he has strong evidence. Therefore, God either doesn't exist or he's not what Jonathan thinks he is. And that's completely flawed reasoning. To start with, that's actually conflating proof and persuasion. Proof and persuasion are different. Proof is the amount of evidence in which you are using to support your position. Whereas persuasion is a person's willingness or ability to accept what is being presented to them. And that's could be different because people are different. Some people don't need any evidence at all. Other people need evidence. Other people's standards are way too high, impossibly high. I think Matt's standards of evidence is way too high for anything in history. You wouldn't be able to substantiate anything in history using a standard of evidence. He sets it that way on purpose, so the resurrection can never pass. It's his arguments are very presuppositional as a result. But a person's willingness to accept evidence or accept a argument or whatnot, or accept a particular conclusion, has no bearing on whether or not if there's good evidence. There could be very good evidence for it, and the person is just not willing to do it, not willing to accept it. So that has nothing to do with it to begin with, and it certainly would not have anything to do with the existence of God. For Matt to be making that conclusion that somehow God doesn't exist, or he's not what that Jonathan or anyone else thinks, or Christians think God is, because he doesn't present evidence against Matt. We have strong evidence. Just because Matt doesn't think it's strong evidence, Matt doesn't think testimonies can ever count as strong evidence. That's his personal opinion. It's not proof, not reasons for, he doesn't really justify it. Not really, other than what he presupposes about testimony. But the fact that he doesn't think that it's strong evidence is no bearing on God, because God does have we do have strong evidence for Jesus' resurrection. We have strong evidence for the existence of God too, but that's a separate issue. Yeah, I think Matt is barking up the wrong tree on this, very much so. Let's continue.
God should be able to understand the issues surrounding sufficient acceptable evidence and should be able to easily overcome it. And that hasn't happened.
Because Matt Dillahunty doesn't think it's happened. That doesn't mean it hasn't happened.
The evidence that Jonathan and I are here engaged in debate about whether or not it's reasonable to accept, or whether or not there's sufficient strong evidence for the resurrection, is evidence that this has not happened, or that I'm crazy. I will have to, that I'm a wholly irrational, unreasonable person.
Bingo.
But a God should understand that these issues surrounding what qualifies as sufficient acceptable evidence and strong evidence, and should be able to overcome. Well, if we assume that there is a God, what reasons might God have for not providing confirmation of strong evidence? Perhaps it's because the actual God isn't the God that Jonathan's advocating for, that either the resurrection didn't happen, or that it's a God for some other religion, or that people have it so wrong, or God has his reasons, or God works in mysterious ways. All of these could provide an excuse for why we don't particularly have strong evidence, but not necessarily an explanation, because if you simultaneously think that God wants you to understand him and know that he existed, know that he came down and took human form and sacrificed himself to himself in some sort of blood magic loophole for rules that he's in charge of, that would be important to actually present.
There's keep going. All right. Again, the fact that Matt Dillahunty is not convinced, it has more to do with his epistemology, and then it has to do with the evidence. But a lot of the reason why he doesn't accept the evidence is because of his epistemology. It isn't because God isn't sufficient to prove something. It's the fact that Matt has made his epistemology in such a way that he becomes unable to accept evidence, strong evidence that's being presented to him. He's already set the deck up, so no matter what, God would fail at it in his mind. And so it's not because God is insufficient. Now, what about that last part that he said? I practically did a double take when I first saw that. He said that somehow that God is sacrificing to himself in some blood magic ritual. So many errors there. This, of course, is a strawman argument completely, because he fails to understand what we believe. First of all, we don't state that Jesus sacrificed himself to himself. Although Jesus was God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are considered three persons that share the one being that is God. And we distinguish between these persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We don't think the Father is the Son. We don't think the Son is the Father. The Son sacrificing himself to the Father isn't the same as sacrificing himself, because that assumes the Son is sacrificing himself to the Son. And that's completely false. That misrepresents what we actually believe in the Trinity in the first place. And magic, we don't think that we don't. This is Jesus sacrificing himself as the Lamb of God goes back to the Jewish sacrificial offerings in the Old Testament. This is not blood magic. It's not magic at all. He often uses magic and almost simultaneously with miracles, I think. Like you'll say magic raised Jesus from the dead, or that we believe magic rose Jesus from the dead. No, we don't. What Christian claims that magic rose Jesus from the dead? Name any of them that claim that magic rose Jesus from the dead. Not one of them do. That is a strawman argument. So the whole thing he just said, strawman argument. Now I realize that from his atheistic, skeptical, naturalistic perspective, and the fact that he's also a magician, he's trying to best understand things like miracles. Jesus' sacrificial offering obviously misrepresents and misunderstands the Trinity doctrine. And I understand he's trying to represent that to the best of his ability in his mindset, the way he thinks as an atheist, as a naturalist, as a magician, as a skeptic, etc. But unfortunately, he is still committing the strawman fallacy, because he's misrepresenting what we actually believe on the subject matter.
Or perhaps there isn't actually a God at all, or not a God that cares or wants to interact or wants to provide evidence. Maybe he's hiding, maybe he just doesn't exist. And this is why we have copies of translations of hearsay accounts for which we can't even identify an author or conduct any realistic investigation.
All right. I have never in my life, other than what I'm hearing from Matt here, ever hear someone uses the idea that they're not convinced that there's evidence for it, is somehow, or that God hasn't provided that evidence with them, it's proof that God must not exist. I've never heard anyone say that before. Matt is the first one to ever present that kind of argument. Well, God must not exist or he must not care. No. Or Matt has set his epistemology up so no matter what, he can't be convinced. It has nothing to do with what God's done, because God has provided us some really good evidence. The problem is that Matt refuses to open his mind up to it. His views are very presuppositional. What about what he said there at the lab? That all we have is just copies of hearsay accounts of an anonymous source. Again, treating the Bible as if it's one source by one author. We see him clearly doing this. It's 66 sources. A lot of the writers identify themselves, so it's not anonymous. It's not even categorized anonymous. Even if you don't think that those people wrote it, it's still not considered anonymous. Not what scholars consider to be anonymous. 7 of Paul's epistles are undisputed, and that's the one with the 1 Corinthians 15 creed in. So, and of course, I already dealt with the copies thing. We got more manuscript copies of the New Testament than we have of any other work of antiquity. In fact, by the way, we have no originals of any work of ancient history. So I don't know why he throws that out there to somehow, oh, well, I guess we don't know. I think he's trying to imply we don't know what was originally written. He doesn't outright say it, but I think that's what he's trying to imply. But that's just not the case. And I already talked about that a little bit. And hearsay accounts, no. In fact, there's a lot of first-hand accounts in the Bible itself. So this is completely bogus. And of course, Paul is getting his information directly from the disciples. And I already mentioned all that. So it was packed with errors, but it's mainly based on his very highly presuppositional epistemology that is set up specifically so no matter what, nothing can be proven. He wants things to be proven to him in an absolute sense, that they can be absolutely proven. But yet the other half of his epistemology is that nothing can be absolutely proven to him. So he automatically sets his epistemology up that no matter what, nothing can be proven to him. And then he says, because it can't be proven to him, God must not exist. Or it's not what Jonathan think he is, or maybe it's God of some other religion, or or maybe God just doesn't care. None of those things are the case. It's just because Matt's epistemology is set up so he cannot be convinced. Matt sets his epistemology up so he won't be convinced of something unless Matt Dillahunty wants to be convinced of it. That has nothing to do with whether God exists or not.
Now, I took notes, and I'll be providing proper rebuttals to a good chunk of what Jonathan said. But I am here primarily to talk about what should count as strong evidence, and why, when it comes to something like the resurrection, which may, if it's true, it's the single most important thing anybody could know. That I don't see anybody could even argue otherwise. If in fact the resurrection is true, there could be nothing more important, I guess. I mean, it fundamentally ties to where you're going to spend eternity, which is the big selling point of apologists. If you were to get hit by a bus and die tonight, do you know where you would spend eternity? Which I think is a flawed presumption that I'm going to be spending eternity anywhere. As far as I can tell, I just cease to exist.
All right. First of all, apologists usually don't say that. Evangelists sometimes do. They'll say, about that, if they're evangelizing the gospel. And that's true, regardless of whether an apologist says it or an evangelist says it. But either way, the question, of course, is pretty much, you could die at any time and you don't know when you're going to die. But Christian apologists typically don't start a conversation like that, nor do they end it most times that way. That's only if someone is trying to evangelize the gospel to them, do we argue that, whatnot. What about what Matt said about his presupposition that he doesn't think that, as far as he can tell, he's going to spend eternity anywhere. Um, the evidence is actually in favor of the fact that we do experience there is an afterlife. Like there's evidence from, for example, near-death experiences. I've got a book here called The Science of Near-Death Experiences, in which is based on articles written by actual scientists or actual medical doctors who wrote peer-reviewed journal articles in major publications and on the subject matter of near-death experiences. And they, we have named John Hagen. He's the editor of the book. He also wrote the introduction to the book. And he says about 9 to 20 million people in the United States has near-death experiences. Let me quote something that he wrote in the introduction to the book. Their recollections often refute physicians' scientific explanations of how an oxygen-starved brain can produce such intense, vivid, and often corroborated vertical recollections. These events are now called near-death experiences, NDEs, and are often life-changing for those people who have them. There is actual evidence of near-death experiences. So yes, there's reasons to believe that we are going to be spending our eternity somewhere beyond the grave. So I don't know why he thinks that as far as he can tell, he can't spend eternity anywhere. I mean, what gives him that assessment? We have reasons to believe that that's not the case. What reasons does he have to believe that that is the case? All right. Let's continue.
But there's nothing here in this resurrection account that would rise to the level of even filing a case, a district attorney filing a case, let alone one that a judge would accept or a jury could become convinced of. Because the evidence isn't strong. There's no body, there's no tomb, there's no blood, there's no sword, there's no spear, there's no cross, there's no DNA, there's no burial rags, despite the fake Shroud of Turin, which I would hope that I actually don't know, because I sat on the plane with somebody who legitimately thought that Shroud of Turin was a thing.
You just heard his wish list, didn't you, of evidence? Sword. What sword? Exactly. There's no sword involved in Jesus' resurrection. What sword? You talking about the sword that some guard used to cut off, or that Peter used to cut off some guard's ear? I mean, what sword is he talking about? Don't know. But he wants the spear. he wants a body, which is ironic because if their tomb was empty, there would be no body. He wants loads of physical evidence. No historical source can ever match that. He knows that, so he sets it up so it would fail no matter what. He wants blood samples. His wish list is just absolutely crazy. Let's have him repeat that again.
There's nothing here in this resurrection account that would rise to the level of even filing a case, a district attorney filing a case, let alone one that a judge would accept or a jury could become convinced of. Because the evidence isn't strong. There's no body, there's no tomb, there's no blood, there's no sword, there's no spear, there's no cross, there's no DNA, there's no burial rags, despite the fake Shroud of Turin, which I would hope that I actually don't know, because I sat on the plane with somebody who legitimately thought that Shroud of Turin was a thing.
Why do you need the cross? To what? Prove that Jesus died by crucifixion? We have historical sources to talk about it. I mean, even outside of the Bible. I mean, we got Josephus. You got 2 references in Josephus. You got 2 references in, or 1 reference in Jewish Talmud, 2 references in Lucian. We got a reference in Tacitus. I mean, we got a reference by a guy by the name Mara Serpion. I mean, and of course, we do have New Testament documents as well. All 4 Gospels, 6 out of the 7 undisputed epistles of Paul references Jesus' crucifixion. You got most of the New Testament referencing Jesus' crucifixion, regardless who you think wrote the New Testament. I mean, yeah, we got tons of evidence for it. Why do you need a cross? You can't believe that Jesus died by crucifixion unless you have a cross. See, this is what I'm talking about. His wish list that he is establishing of what he would like to see is unreasonable. You can always want more if you really think about it. But the fact of the matter is, that does not mean that what we got is not good enough to prove the proposition. We don't have to have blood samples and DNA evidence to prove the case. We just need the historical data that we do have. His wish list is completely unreasonable. He wants blood, so he does want a blood sample. He wants a blood sample. Whose blood sample he is want? Jesus's? I want a blood sample to prove that Jesus, what? That he existed? That you can trace his, maybe his picture on mug shots or something? I mean, come on now. I don't know what to say about that. I mean, it is just so terribly unreasonable. I don't understand how anyone can not see it unreasonable. To sit there and just, I have to be able to talk to the witnesses. I have to have blood sample. I have to have DNA evidence. I have to, have a body in a tomb, even though, if Jesus rose again from the dead, there would be no body in a tomb. I have to have all that before I can even be convinced. He sets himself up so he cannot be convinced, is ultimately what it comes down to. Let's continue.
It's a fake, but there's no witnesses, no crime scene.
Oh, yeah. The Shroud of Turin, that's disputed. We don't know if it was a fake. We've never been able to substantiate that it's true. We've never been able to substantiate that it wasn't true. We don't know. For him to assert it dogmatically and something that's that heavily disputed. In a interview with Cameron from Captain Christianity, Gary Habermas, he's one of the world's foremost experts on the subject of resurrection. He gave it a 60% probability that it was likely. 60%, which is, it's not as high as we would like, but it's as high as 50%. Personally, I don't know if the Shroud of Turin was authentic or not. I'm okay with it being authentic. I'm okay with it not being authentic. I think it's a good likelihood that it could be, but there's just no way of knowing beyond a shadow of doubt. But the really interesting thing here is, why does Matt think it was a fake? Why does Matt dogmatically assert that it's a fake? I mean, it's heavily disputed. The blood sample in it was proven authentic, that it is blood. So, why would you think that? I don't know. Either way, it's completely irrelevant to the situation, because even if it was fake, it would have no bearing on the evidence that we have for Jesus' resurrection.
Investigators, no finding of facts at all. In fact, while I'm not a mythicist, and I'm fine with the notion that Jesus probably existed in some form, the advocates of this tale can't even reasonably confirm the existence of the person they claim died and was resurrected. Because it all ties back to, here's a collection of writings that we have that we can't source. They're just tradition. They're just the hearsay of the collection of people who agreed with and accepted these claims.
Okay. We can't source. What does he mean by that? The only thing I can think of that he means is that it cannot be corroborated outside of the Bible, which is not true. Lots of stuff that the Bible claims can be corroborated outside of Scripture. In fact, including Jesus' existence, actually, because we have 39 sources apart from the Bible. to testify to Jesus' existence. I mentioned there's two references in the Jewish Talmud. One of them was on Jesus' crucifixion. The other was on Jesus' miracles. We have two references to Jesus in the Josephus, in Antiquities of the Jews of Josephus. We have two references by Lucian. We have a reference by Tacitus. We have a reference by, we can add beyond crucifixion even, references to things, to Jesus' existence by Pliny the Younger, by the Roman Emperor, I think his name was Tatius, something like that, around AD 100, that Pliny the Younger was writing to. We've got the Gnostic Gospels. We have Suetonius. We have numerous accounts of Jesus outside of the Bible. And if you would throw in the Bible, then we have at least 27 books of the New Testament, including all four Gospels, testifying to Jesus' existence. So you got 39 sources plus the 27 New Testament. And remember, the 27 letters of the New Testament circulated independently of each other in the first century, and was copied independently of each other. It wasn't like in the collection that we have it today. And that's what Matt seems to be treating it like he's attacking the finished product that we have today and neglecting the history of the Bible in the process. But the New Testament was written independently of each other in the first century. It's 27 different sources. So these are all sources for Jesus written in the first century, regardless of what you believe about. And of course, you combine that with the 39 sources that existed outside of the Bible as well. So that puts us with 66 sources total for the historical Jesus. 66. So what's he getting this that cannot be sourced, that we have no proof? Now, that has this tendency to do this thing that gets on my nerves a lot of times in these debates. He will sit there and throw out mere possibilities. It's committing the possibility or killing the possibility fallacy. But he throws mere possibilities out there. When he's challenged on these possibilities, he retracts. It reminds me, a lot of times I describe it like a turtle that gets caught out of its shell, its limbs and its head is caught outside of its shell, unaware, unexpected, and then he pulls himself back into his shell to hide. When Matt is challenged, he seems to do that. He pulls back into his shell. He'll say, "Oh, I'm not a mythicist. I'm not saying Jesus didn't exist," even though he just threw out the possibility. He'll do that with Jesus' crucifixion. He'll throw out the possibility that maybe Jesus didn't really die on crucifixion. He was trying to support it. Oh, I'm not really supporting the swing theory. I'm not really supporting this particular position. He'll do that because he doesn't like being challenged, but he'll throw out these mere possibilities. And then when you deal with them, when you challenge them and you show that they're flawed, he'll sit there and says, well, yeah, but I'm not really this. I'm not really advocating for it, just so that you can't challenge his arguments. But if he's going to throw it out there, it's going to get challenged. All right, let's continue.
Story. I'm not saying those people are wrong. I don't know how you would prove they're wrong, but they haven't presented strong evidence to show they're right. So what would happen if I claimed to raise someone from the dead, and you came and said, hey, we want to see this guy that you raised from the dead? Now, if I present someone that was living and I had no case to show where they'd actually died, okay, nobody's going to believe me. Nobody should believe me. But if I said, hey, that person that I raised from the dead, they're not here anymore. They've ascended to another plane, and now you can't investigate this at all.
What Christian claims that you can't investigate this at all? We don't claim that. We claim that we can investigate it. That's the whole point. We wouldn't be having these discussions and debates if we didn't think we could prove the position we have. We never claim that you can't investigate it at all. That's his perception because he thinks you can't investigate it. Not because we're saying that.
Would we have good reason to believe it? What if there were people who said they saw me do this? what if I kept telling people that this person who I raised from the dead is going to come back eventually, and yet they apparently repeatedly failed to do so? They didn't show up to say, yep, Matt's right, he raised me from the dead, or hey, Matt's right, I was raised from the dead, I did through this power or however else. There's nothing along there.
So he needs the disciples somehow to come back from life after 2,000 years and tell him all about Jesus raised from the dead. Or perhaps God needs to come down here and explain it to him.
The truth here is that the best evidence for the resurrection of Jesus isn't remotely something that I could consider strong. Is there evidence? Yes, in the sense that there's anecdotal, testimonial evidence, but that shouldn't be enough to conclude that somebody raised from the dead.
All right. This is one of the few times he's going to actually admit that there could be considered evidence in that sense. But he'll claim it's not sufficient enough. But later he'll bounce back and forth in this. But he'll talk about his argument of claiming not evidence because he'll try to deny the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, that he'll claim that there's no evidence to just claims. And we'll deal with that in a little bit. But this is one of the few times where he shows his hand as being inconsistent because he admits it. There is evidence. He just doesn't think it's sufficient enough, which is a separate question from whether it actually is considered evidence. When he says that their claims are not evidence, which he will, this is a different distinction with a different response to it. Now, if his claim is, oh, it's not sufficient enough to prove Jesus rose again from the dead, this requires a different response. But it is sufficient to prove that Jesus rose again from the dead if we have good evidence. But you have to understand, it's not just one fact that we have. It's not just one piece of data, one piece of evidence. It's a cumulative case, a totality of evidence and data that we do have. Among them is the testimony of the disciples and the testimony of Paul and that sort of thing. But it's also the other facts involved as well, including the very origin of the Christian's church. The Christian church came into being as a result of being based upon a crucified Messiah that risen from the dead. Now, given their messianic expectations, their beliefs about crucifixion and the concept of resurrection, you have to be able to explain how did Christianity come into being. If Jesus did not physically rise again from the dead, how did it ever come into being? Christianity is a faith system that should not exist if Jesus had never risen from the dead. N.T. Wright said it best. He said, this is why, as a historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. So, so there's lots of evidence, really good evidence, for Jesus rising again from the dead. The fact that Matt's not convinced of it has no bearing on whether or not Jesus rose again from the dead. Let's continue.
I'm not quite sure what sort of evidence we could present, but if everything we presented is nothing that would be admissible in a court of law or sufficient to lead someone to the conclusion that, yeah, we've almost certainly sorted this out and Jesus rose from the dead. If we were starting to consider evidence, weak evidence, as if it were strong, we'd be flooding evidence that was this week. Here's an old book by somebody we don't know, and I'm convinced that it was written by this person who's an eyewitness, and we're just going to take their word as an eyewitness that they and some other people are witnesses to the resurrection of the incarnation of God. If we accepted that as strong evidence, then our courtrooms would be once again flooded with spectral evidence and witch trials and other things, because the evidence for this resurrection claim is not in any way stronger than the evidence for alien abductions or somebody's claims about what a witch did in the woods late at night.
All right. Again, lots of errors here. I want to talk about what he said a minute ago. Let's back up.
Is there evidence? Yes, in the sense that there's anecdotal, testimonial evidence, but that or sufficient to lead someone to the conclusion that, yeah, we've almost certainly sorted this out and Jesus rose from the dead. If we were starting to consider evidence, weak evidence, as if it were strong, we'd be flooding evidence that was this week. Here's an old book by somebody we don't know, and I'm convinced that it was written by this person who's an eyewitness, and we're just going to take their word as an eyewitness that they and some other people are witnesses to the resurrection of the incarnation of God.
All right. Yeah, lots of errors. But let's deal with what he said on the. Okay, here's an old book. Again, he's seems to be making. He doesn't, like I said, he doesn't outright explicitly say it. He seems to be making a correlation with it being old or ancient to whether we can trust it or not, and that's just that kind of thinking would lead us to not trust anything that we have written in ancient history. Secondly, and this is a major thing, I don't know if I've been able to stress this. It's easy, but he seems to be arguing in a way that seems the Bible is one book. He says he considers it one book, one source, like it's written by one writer, and that writer, we don't have no idea who wrote it. And that's just not the case. I mean, that completely undermines what we actually know about the history of the Bible. The Bible is actually 66 sources. It's not one source, it's 66 sources. The New Testament itself was 27 independent sources that were written in first century, that circulated independently, was copied independently of each other. And it wasn't actually gathered in a collective form at all until the 2nd century. That's when they began to actually gather them together and produce them in codex forms and things like that. But in first century, they were written independently on scrolls, and they were copied independently of each other. So this idea of treating it like it's one source written by one writer, it's factually inaccurate. Let's continue further.
If we accepted that as strong evidence, then our courtrooms would be once again flooded with spectral evidence and witch trials and other things, because the evidence for this resurrection claim is not in any way stronger than the evidence for alien abductions or somebody's claims about what a witch did in the woods late at night.
All right. Matt is making a fallacy in logic called the slippery slope fallacy. Slippery slope fallacy is when you assume that if A, then B, then C, then D, without showing a causal connection between A, B, C, and D. You might have different reasons for accepting A and different reasons for rejecting B. You might have good reasons for thinking that B is false, and like evidence against B. But we might have good reasons for believing that A is true. So slippery slope. So this commits the slippery slope fallacy. And again, he's presuming that we don't have good evidence for the resurrection. I can understand why he would presume that, because that's his whole argument. That's his whole conclusion. Now, this commits the slippery slope fallacy. If A, then B, then C, then D, and without showing a causal connection, obviously he is presuming, presupposing the evidence that doesn't have any evidence. I can understand why he does, because that's his whole argument, it's his whole position. But at the same time, there is good evidence for Jesus' resurrection. He just doesn't want to accept it as good evidence. But in any given case, it is committing the slippery slope fallacy. Acceptance of one doesn't lead to acceptance of the other, because we could have different reasons for accepting one and rejecting another. For example, we could have evidence no evidence in favor. We can have good evidence in favor of A, but no evidence in favor of B, or we can have good evidence against B, and therefore, we accept A, but we reject B. We still have to look at the, or as Jonathan said, the particulars of the case. We still have to look at the specifics. Let's continue.
How much more do we have to learn about good standards of evidence before the folks advocating for this resurrection account finally begin to realize that what they're pointing to doesn't and shouldn't and won't ever count as strong evidence? Strong evidence is physical evidence. It is well documented. It would be the eyewitness testimony of a handful of people who were questioned, cross-examined, who were recorded, who demonstrated that they didn't have a particular bias in a particular direction, that they were actually presenting what they saw honestly. We have no ability to investigate.
Okay. In order for, there was lots, in that one little passage, he made lots of errors. Okay. That we couldn't let's deal with the cross-check thing. Again, as already mentioned, you can't cross-check any witness in the past. That doesn't mean the event didn't take place, or that historians don't utilize testimonies of people that discuss things that happened in the past. So yeah, that we have to have them in front of us to cross-check what they said. No, we don't have to have them in front of us to be able to know what they said. Unbiased. He says they have to be unbiased. Nobody is unbiased, including Matt. If we have to have unbiased witnesses, we're not going to find unbiased witnesses, because everybody has an axe to grind in some sense. Sometimes they might even have biases. They can have biases in opposite directions. Maybe they have a bias in favor of the idea God doesn't exist, or a bias in favor of Jesus not resurrected from the dead. This idea that somehow that they have to be unbiased. Good luck finding that. You ain't gonna find it. But being biased doesn't make us wrong. The source is wrong. By the way, that actually commits a fallacy in law called circumstantial ad hominem. It's a tax. It's also called appealing to bias. It's basically when you argue that a person's bias somehow makes them wrong, lying, or unreliable in some sense. Being biased, though, doesn't make them unreliable. That doesn't guarantee that they won't be unreliable. Some people there that, in favor of their biases might not be very reliable, but it's a case-by-case basis. And I'm not saying bias doesn't play a factor at all. It plays somewhat a factor, but it is, and it's always important to understand where a person is coming from with their bias. But that's not the same as assuming that we can't trust the account because they're biased. All right, let's continue. It's
on par or worse than the evidence offered by someone trying to sell me a bridge, someone trying to get me started in their as an underling in their multi-level marketing scam, or the money that my Nigerian prince has set aside for me.
All right. Again, he makes the false analogy fallacy again, because the fact it's not on par, example we'll start with, to people that have a motivation to lie to you in order to get you to send the money. Disciples aren't trying to get rich off of it or anything like that by telling Jesus rose again from the dead. So it's not on par with it. It is the false analogy fallacy again. He also said something earlier. I mentioned this before as well. He has this thing where he just assumes that you have no way of investigating it. We have a way of investigating it. We investigate it through historical methodology. He just doesn't agree with historical methodology is the issue.
If that's the case, then I don't know how we can consider the evidence strong, and no amount of pretending will actually change that. When we're
nobody's pretending
talking about a resurrection, Jonathan begins by assuming that there is a person, a death, and an account of a resurrection that we need to make some sort of explanation for. Now, obviously, during the rebuttal, we'll get into this a little bit better. But I think he's already starting a little bit too far down the track, because certainly we have a story that accounts for a death and a resurrection. But how do we, if you're going to list the ways in which we can account for a story, I think he overlooked at least one, if not several options, because what he presented was essentially a version of the liar, lunatic, or Lord, and he left out the legend option, which is where I'll stand. Thank you.
Well, Jonathan wasn't actually trying to propose the lying, lunatic, Lord option. This was in his opening case, but he was really just trying to, and he actually mentioned that, by the way. Now, I guess Matt and him got their wires crossed exactly what they mean by the word myth and legend, and Matt thought that they meant something completely different, and therefore he doesn't mention it. But in any case, Jonathan actually does discuss it. So he wasn't trying to make what's called a trilemma, which is similar to either word fallacy or false dilemma fallacy, a false trilemma. He wasn't trying to do that. And of course, Matt will claim legend. He says he's not a mythicist. He believes that Jesus exists in some form. But the reality is, then he throws out these possibilities and think they're not going to get challenged. We have tons of historical evidence of Jesus' existence. It's way too strong to ignore. I'm not saying Matt's trying to ignore it, but it's there. I mean, it's not just the Bible. It's not, just Christian sources. We've got non-Christian sources as well, and we got numerous Christian sources on top of that, as well as sources in the Bible. And you can combine all that, and Jesus definitely existed, and we definitely know that he died by crucifixion. In fact, his crucifixion is considered both by the Jesus Seminar and Bart Ehrman to be the best attested fact in ancient history about Jesus. And so, yeah, I don't know. I don't think Matt specifically would take the spoon theory or any other theories like that. And he's willing to say that he thinks that Jesus probably died, but only because he's willing to admit that he lived. If he lived, he's figured he must have died. But he's not going to concede that we have good evidence specifically of his death by crucifixion, which we do. We have tons of evidence for his crucifixion. Again, this is considered one of the best attested facts in ancient history about Jesus. So we do have evidence. We do have a way of cross-checking it, and we have good reason to believe that this happened and that Jesus existed. I think this ends his part in that.
You bet. Thank you very much.
All right. We're going to close on part 1 of this video series. I'm going to continue it. And I wanted to invite you to watch all of the parts in this video. I'm not exactly sure how many I'm going to have. I know I'm going to do one on after I did the opening statement of Matt. I'm going to do one on his rebuttal, and I'm also going to do one on the crossfire section, as well as one on Q&A. And of course, I'm going to do a closing video on my own remarks and my evaluation of this debate on Matt's argument on claim of evidence. Now, we didn't get much into this because he doesn't go specifically in this. I think Jonathan challenges him on this because he has argued it in his other debates, and so they got more specific in it during the crossfire section. So I may wait after the crossfire section to actually do my presentation of Matt's argument of claims, not evidence. Meanwhile, please like and subscribe to this video, and I'll see you on the next one. Again, I hope you liked this video. Please like and subscribe. Don't forget to hit the notification bell below. It lets you know when any new videos release. I usually release at least one video per week, sometimes multiple times a week. So if you hit that notification bell, you'll be instantly alerted whenever a new video becomes live. I'm going to be making lots of apologetic material. I've got at least part 2 of this series today. I also have a video presentation, a PowerPoint presentation, which I want to introduce on the fallacies that Matt is making in the claims not evidence thing he does with the testimonies of the disciples. And I want to deal with that as well as probably a video presentation eventually of Matt's flawed epistemology. At least a short video talking about it. All right, stay tuned for part 2 of this series on my debate review between Dr. Jonathan McLatchie and Matt Dillahunty. Oh yeah, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and remember to always learn the facts the critics don't want you to know. Thank you.